Hi, Lou Pulsifer here to discuss the question, are esports actually sports? Well, I'm a big team sports fan, and as far as I'm concerned, esports have most of the elements of team sports. It's just that there's a very different context, and that context involves the skills that are required. Traditional team sports require gross motor skills and coordination, whereas esports require fine motor skills and coordination. But otherwise you have all the other elements of team sports. And that derives from the nature of video games themselves. Video games have always been about physical skills, but now we've added direct competition, whether they're humans, usually team competition. Think about video games. There are two ways to contrast games. You have Athleticware, as I call it, which relates to athletic-like requirements and physical skills, which are usually sports or real-time video games. And of course, most video games are real-time games. Then we have Brainware, which is a term coined by my wife, because I was looking for a term that reflected games that require thinking and mental efforts, but not physical efforts, which are usually tabletop games and turn-based video games. So, Athleticware requires athletic physical skills such as eye-hand coordination, rapid movement, precise movement, which characterizes most non-computer sports and most real-time video games. Many video games with the appearance of battle or even warfare still depend primarily on athletic physical skills. To successfully compete in StarCraft against top-class players, you have to do 200 actions per minute. Well, most people never get that good at StarCraft, even if they play a lot. You have to have some talent to get to 200 actions per minute. Another name we could use would be physical wear, but I like athletic wear. Now, I remember when I was a kid, we would play tank war games with little plastic tanks in a basement or outside, and rather than roll dice to determine whether there was a hit, or somehow use a computer to determine whether there was a hit, of course there were no computers at that time to speak of, we threw things. We threw objects to see if we could hit the enemy tank. Now, video games use a different physical skill set than throwing things, but is it fundamentally different? Of course, there are also physical or athletic tabletop games such as Snap and Lightspeed. A game that involves both to a considerable extent is American football. It's both athletic and cerebral, and the same can be said for real-time strategy games. But the athletic is much more important than the cerebral, even a sport as cerebral as American football. You can have the best plays and the best coaching. If the players are not up to it, you're not going to win. Contrast this with Brainware, where the primary skills are mental and don't require physical activity. There are several categories of these kinds of games. There are puzzles, which have more or less always correct solutions. You follow these steps and you will succeed. And in speed runs in many video games, it amounts to the same thing. There are sometimes minor randomizers, but single-player video games are usually puzzles. Then we also have games involving psychology or yomi. Poker is a simple one. Many multiplayer, more than two-player, more than two sides. Tabletop games involve yomi, reading the mind of the opponent, understanding the intentions of the opponent, outguessing the opponent. And many of these games are turn-based in general. So, to me, eSports is just an extension of traditional hardcore video games, where we've replaced the computer opposition with human opposition, and we often now have teams versus teams, rather than one player against one computer. Again, the difference is that the skills are fine movement and control skills, not the gross movement and control skills of Major League sports. All the other trappings of big-time sports are now there. There's enough prize money and money from the streaming and so on to support athletes who can make more than $100,000 annually. Well, when I was a kid, and I'm 64, football and basketball pros only made this much money adjusted for inflation, or even less. The owner of the Carolina Panthers was a football player who caught a touchdown pass in an NFL championship game in 1957 or 1959. And he got a big bonus, $4,000 or $5,000, which was a lot more money then than it is now, far more. And he decided to quit football and invest the money in Hardee's, I believe, and ended up being able to buy a franchise and owns the Carolina Panthers. Nowadays, a professional athlete would never do that because he can make far more money in the sport than he can outside the sport. The reason I'm discussing this is that when major professional sports started out, the athletes didn't make all that much money. Just as in the eSports, a lot of the athletes don't make all that much money. Whether that will change, whether they end up making millions of dollars a year, who knows? What about crowds? We now fill indoor stadiums with the crowds to watch eSports. And we have commentators. And we have TV broadcasts, and especially streaming broadcasts. Again, when I was a kid, I remember when football, basketball, and ice hockey first got national TV contracts. Baseball had it for a long time, but those other sports did not. I remember when pro basketball teams struggled mightily to fill stadiums, and often they didn't. Detroit Pistons, 6,000 or 7,000 fans a game, a lot fewer than the college teams were getting. We're already past that stage in eSports. There's a heavy intensity now in eSports. There's betting. There's match fixing. Here's a reference to one report of match fixing. There's direct, intense player-to-player competition. Some of the players play full-time. Some of them practice more than major league athletes. Not so long ago, some professional players of one of the MOBAs were granted a visa to come to the United States because they were regarded as athletes. There are all the trappings of professional team sports. So esports games are designed, whether intentionally or not, to meet team sports standards. Athletic skills are required, they're highly competitive, they require intense repetitive practice to improve, and nowadays are usually team-based, although StarCraft is not. Is it worth trying to design one? I don't think so. How many games reach anything like esports status? A couple a year, maybe less. They're usually also AAA level games, not indie games, not mobile games. So you'd have to be part of a AAA level team to do this, and most people in game development are not. To me, trying to design a game to be an esports standard is like at least as futile as trying to design the next great innovation in games. It's the players who determine what games become esports. If it happens, it happens, but you can't plan for it. And that, in fact, is what Blizzard says about it. Now, there are naysayers here, and ESPN sports honcho rejected esports broadcasting. He said, they're not sports. Well, it would have made a lot more sense if he'd said esports are not gross movement physical sports, and we specialize in gross movement physical sports. That'd make a lot more sense. Traditionalists don't like change. That's the way it is. And we can't forget, many older people still think of video games as only for kids. So, as far as I'm concerned, if it walks like a duck and it talks like a duck, it smells like a duck, even if it doesn't quite look like a duck, it's a duck. It's a sport. You could put this another way. How could you not regard highly competitive tests of physical skills as sports? Young people get it. There's an eSports club at North Carolina State University rather than a video club.